Okay, hello, we're back. We're going to start looking at Baroque art today. After our discussion, our presentation last time, talking about the Baroque period, some of the characteristics of the Baroque period. To start a foray into the Baroque, I thought it would be interesting to concentrate on painting in Italy. The primary point of starting out this way is to gain a general sense of the Baroque artistic sensibility, at least as it was manifesting in the South. We're going to begin with the Italian Baroque artist Caravaggio. Our text states that Caravaggio is one of the figures that lays the foundations of the Baroque style. This, I think, is a fairly bold statement, but is definitely arguable. Michelangelo Merisi, which is his name, born in 1573 and died in 1610, is better known to us now simply as we call him, Caravaggio. He can generally be typed as one of those characters of the Baroque period that explored the darker aspects of life and death. What we see in Caravaggio's work as a kind of shocking, a very stark, raw portrayal of both biblical stories and secular scenes. All this really has to be seen in light of Caravaggio's somewhat violent and tumultuous life. From his arrival in Rome, which was in 1590, Caravaggio was constantly in trouble with the law. He lived a very unconventional life for the time, and more or less alienated himself through his very wild and literally very violent temperament. His anger and temper got to the better of him when, in 1606, he stabbed someone to death over a disagreement in a tennis match. Caravaggio went on the lam, fleeing to Naples and then to Malta, where he was then arrested in Malta after attacking a police officer. He escaped jail and eventually made his way back to Naples, where in a bar brawl basically left him seriously wounded. And because of this, Caravaggio, he ended up dying on his way back to Rome, where it seemed that he was most likely going to be pardoned for his murder. His death apparently was the result of yet another fight with sailors who he thought had robbed him. This was at in a bar. So this was the kind of life that Caravaggio led. His rebelliousness, his contrariness, definitely made itself present in his painting. For one thing about Caravaggio was that he refused in his artwork to accept the traditionally idealized versions of biblical scenes as they were being called for by the Counter-Reformationists, okay? And then secondly, instead of setting his figures in very elegant and elaborate settings, Caravaggio placed them in often very common day settings. And then not only that, put them in settings that were very impoverished looking, very poor, usually setting them in very dark shadows and often in very dark interiors. Let's look at some examples. This is probably his most well-known work, or at least could be argued that his most well-known painting. This is called The Calling of St. Matthew. And this is an example of those very characteristics. You've got the relatively extreme use of light and shadow here, and we'll see this in practically all the paintings we're going to look at of Caravaggio today. And this very carefully modulated use of lights and shadows. As the text rightly describes this, quote, when this isn't handled well, the use of heavy shadows surrounding brightly lit figures in the foreground tends to be artificial and over-theatrical. For Caravaggio, he uses light and darks in the service for emotional impact, for expressive content. And we'll see this over and over again. But this is not at all what the clergy was expecting, nor was it what they were looking for. For one, Christ here is seen in what amounts to a Roman tavern, with these kind of gaudily dressed men at a rough table with coins and cards laying all about them. Something else to note of interest is that Caravaggio was, of course, aware that he shared a common name, Christian name, with Michelangelo, whom he visually quotes here. And I'm wondering if, before I actually point it out, if you can see what it is that Caravaggio is quoting. He's quoting something that comes from a very famous painting by Michelangelo. Basically, if you notice the hand of Jesus, this outstretched hand, basically like this, that is, of course, quoting Michelangelo's The Birth of Adam from the Sistine Chapel, when God stretches out his hand, of course, to touch the tip of the finger of Adam. Okay, I'm sorry I didn't bring that. I should have included that as the next slide so you could see the comparison. Go back and look at the Sistine ceiling and go and look at that panel. I think there's an enlargement of that in our book. Flip that back and forth between this image of St. Matthew, and you will see that obviously Caravaggio is quoting Michelangelo. Kind of fun. Okay. The lighting is the same as... I'm way off. Where am I? Back up here again. Another famous painting. Let's go on and look at another one by Caravaggio. This is called The Conversion of St. Paul from 1601. This is quite large. This is 90 inches by 69 inches. So here we see St. Paul laying flat on his back, while we see also a stable attendant who seems to be maneuvering a horse away from the fallen master. Notice also, this is very, very weird. This scene is nowhere. There's no background. This doesn't exist in any kind of like a context. There's no environment. It's strange, and this is a very new effect in painting. So this isn't generally a kind of really a shocking portrayal for the time. It lacks any kind of finesse. It lacks a kind of sense of propriety. It's as if what we're seeing is looking at no more than a man who's, who drank too much and has basically fallen off his horse, and is now is in danger of being stepped on. The other thing that's very weird about this, and this is again why the Counter-Reformationist clergy were not really interested in Caravaggio's work, even though these were, of course, from biblical stories. Notice how much space the horse takes up here. It's as if the horse is the hero of the painting. It's the main character. So you have that. You have the explicitness, the shoddy setting. You've got this weird angle of view, kind of all kind of mesh. All this must have been basically very scandalous to the clergy. One writer also notes that Caravaggio's lighting in his scenes was like the flash photographers on a police camera. This violently contrasting light and dark was basically unlike anything seen before. This is a brand new kind of visual effect that Caravaggio develops during this period. We saw hints of it maybe with Leonardo da Vinci, but nothing to this degree whatsoever. One other thing to note about this is also very important, should be in your review sheets, is to notice the claustrophobia of this. There's no breathing space. He's cut the edges of the frame right down to what is going on in terms of the scene. There's no space around the horse, the figures. Everything's kind of compressed together in this very, very tight little space. So there's this uneasiness, I think, in a lot of Caravaggio's work, you'll notice, because of this feeling of claustrophobia. There was also something very, very particular to Caravaggio that I think was part of his desire to create this kind of heightened, kind of emotional uneasiness in his paintings or in his work. Let's look at another example. This was one of the last works of Caravaggio. This is before he left Rome. This is David with the Head of Goliath, 1606. Caravaggio once again quotes Michelangelo. The way he quotes Michelangelo is that the head that David has in the beheaded head that David has here, holding by the hair, is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. This is Caravaggio's head. And so what he's done here has, and if you remember, we pointed this out, is that Michelangelo in the the flaying of Saint Bartholomew, that the face of Saint Bartholomew's carcass here is actually Michelangelo. Okay, so here Caravaggio is doing the very same thing by having the head of Goliath be actually himself. The lighting we can see is the same as before. It's from this single light source. It's dramatic in such a way that it illuminates only that which is necessary to create this emotional impact. Everything else is eliminated into the shadows. Again, we have this blacked out space. Notice also this compressed frame. Notice this kind of claustrophobic, tight little frame in which this all exists. Like Michelangelo, we could say that Caravaggio is showing himself here as completely defeated, as a defeated kind of tragic figure. It could be speculated that this is in some way an image in which Caravaggio reflects on his own troubles, that sees the dark and violent side of himself as something that, in being really beyond redemption, he sees as something that only can be resolved by the sword. Okay, so Caravaggio, our first Renaissance artist that we look at, very, very important figure, and somebody that will be very, very influential in the artwork that is to come. Let's move on to that from that now and look at some of the Baroque ceiling paintings. One last thing is to just finish with Caravaggio, that this new approach that Caravaggio brought on was, of course, more than his contemporaries could really dealing with. And again, these settings were really blasphemous in their apparent disrespect for the holiness of the subject matter. Okay, and then here's another one that's in your book. This is This is the Madonna of Loreto. Okay, so here we see the Madonna with a Christ child in her arms, and look at, she's in this doorway of some lower class, kind of poverty-stricken neighborhood. This chipped up old doorway, the kind of dirt on the streets. So this was just unthinkable what Caravaggio was doing. He was just flying in the face of authority all over the place. So yes, this disrespect for the holiness of the subject matter, the emotional expressiveness, in a sense, of all this was much too dark, it was much too extreme. The shock of this eventually is going to wear off, both stylistically and also in terms of its emotional impact. And it's going to be more and more appreciated for its honesty, as well as for the dexterity and the emotional poignance of its work. And again, this is going to have a big impact on artists later in the Baroque that we'll see both in Italy and with artists in the north. Okay, so very important, Caravaggio. Before we go on to look at some of the ceiling painting of the Italian Baroque, which I want to also cover today, I want us also look at one of the very few noted women artists of the past. And few have been really kind of accounted for preceding the 20th century. This is, if we go into our history book, that we start to see women appearing more and more regularly as important figures in the history of Western art. Artemisia Gentileschi, who we're going to look at here, was, as our text describes, described as the first woman in the history of Western art to make a significant contribution to the art of her time. And here we're going to look at the book that's reproduced in our the artwork that's reproduced in our book. I think this is a very loaded statement that our book gives, one which the faculty who teaches the Women in Art course, history course here, Gloria Maya, addresses in this very class of hers. When we talk about the lack of women in the history of art, we're faced with a lot of issues here. We're faced with things like the social and cultural limitations that have been placed on women throughout history of the Western world. And not only that, as well the fact that the writing of history, the writing of Western history, has been a male-dominated practice. Okay, and so for all these reasons, this is why there's no reason why Gentileschi should be one of the few and only women that appears in the history of Western art. Okay, so that said, Gentileschi, she was in fact the daughter of a well-known painter and was part of the art world since her youth. She was encouraged to continue the history of the Western world. And not only that, as well the fact that the writing of history, the writing of Western history has been a male-dominated practice. Okay, and so for all these reasons, this is why, there's no reason why Gentileschi should be one of the few and only women that appears in the history of Western art. Okay, so that said, Gentileschi, she was in fact the daughter of a well-known painter and was part of the art world since her youth. She was encouraged to continue the family lineage of painters, and developed into a painter equally in terms of her production of the quality of work that was equal to any of the work that was being done of her time. This is her most famous painting. This is called Judith and Holofernes from 1620. This is a biblical story. Is of the Jewish heroine Judith, who saves her people from the Assyrians by winning the confidence of the Assyrian general Holofernes, and basically cuts off his head when his guard was down. As the text notes, of course, it's interesting that this scene may be read in light of not only as an interesting theme for Gentileschi to portray here in this very powerful and dramatic and violent painting, but also as perhaps something that's reflective of the fact that Gentileschi was herself a rape victim in her youth. So notice also this is very much in the style of Caravaggio. The dramatic single light source that we have here, the dramatic moment of the slaying, the graphicness of the event, and then also notice this very tightly cropped frame. So in short, basically all these devices Caravaggio also used in creating a kind of heightened emotional effect. And this is, of course, to say how Caravaggio was greatly impacting on the artists that followed during this period, and Artemisis Gentileschi was one of them. Let me see what my next image is of. Okay, good. Okay, now, another sensibility of the Baroque art can be seen in the works of a family of artists. There were two brothers, Annibale and Agostino Carracci, and their cousin Ludovico. Together they were just generally known as the Carracci, because it was this family of well-known painters at the time. The Carracci were part of a Bologna school of artists, many of whom would carry their talents to Rome in later years. Another connection with Rome is that Bologna was the northernmost city of the Papal States and had, for this reason, direct cultural connections with the Vatican. The artists of Bologna, for sure, this family, the Carracci as they're known, wanted to synthesize the kind of the robustness and the majesty of Michelangelo, combine that with the grace of Raphael, the color of Titian, and in a word, to encapsulate the best of the High Renaissance. So let's look at an example of the work of the Carracci, and most notably, the most famous work of the Carracci here is the work done by the son Annibale, and his most famous work here is this Galleria, this ceiling painting in the Galleria of the Palazzo Farnese. The ceiling work really rivals the Sistine ceiling in many ways, particularly just because of its complexity of the themes, the organization of such. You have these large scenes, and then smaller scenes that are interspersed. You have these apparently real seated nudes. You have simulated marble architecture. So there's a kind of a complexness that really in some ways really exceeds, you might say, Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling. Thematically, the fresco cycle is based on Greek and Roman mythology, which is depicting the loves of the gods. The centerpiece of the ceiling fresco is this is the Triumph of Bacchus and Adrian. Okay, and on the face of it, the subject matter might seem kind of incompatible with the ecclesiastical status of the patron of the Counter-Reformation. However, like the Renaissance period, the reference to pagan times was basically being organized to fit within the thinking of the Catholic Church. In short, the ceiling fresco painted by Annabelle Carracci of 11 scenes amounts to, you might say, a symbolization of the triumph of divine love. In this case, we're seeing this divine love in physical form. Generally speaking, this is a temperament on love that's very much a part of the Baroque times. We'll see this elsewhere in other examples that we're about to see of ceiling painting. In other words, divine love, conceived as the source of the universe, was that which draws together all the elements of the ceiling fresco and resolves, you might say, all conflicts in a divine act of redemption. Also, I want you to notice here that this style is very, very, not only is it very Renaissance in its effect, compared to, say, the emotional drama of Caravaggio, this is much more kind of toned down, much more balanced. Not only that, notice these very Michelangelo-esque figures. So Carracci basically is really trying to, in a sense, quote Michelangelo, not only in terms of the complexity of his ceiling work at the Palazzo Farnese, but also in terms of stylistically the kinds of figures that he's portraying and the kind of style of the figures themselves. So yes, the dramatic departure from the mood and the style of somebody like Caravaggio. We have in this a kind of a sense of life, of movement, of celebration. The tone is really sort of bright and celebratory. Let's go back and look at the wider view. Very much life-affirming, and it's precisely this kind of tone that the Counter-Reformation patrons were looking for to celebrate the reestablishment of the papacy. And this, of course, was commissioned by the papal court. Carracci does share some of the characteristics that we find with Caravaggio, namely the concern for detailed realism, and the same Baroque portrayal of extremes of emotion. Again, but we don't see this really here. What emotion that we do have is much more positive. It's much more optimistic than somebody like Caravaggio. So this is the kind of the starting point for the ceiling compositions of the 17th century that were to follow. And it's also a keystone for Baroque monumental painting in general, except for, especially for the artists such as Peter Paul Rubens, who was very much influenced, as we'll see here, by Annabelle Carracci's style. And I don't know if I put in a Rubens here. Let's see if there's a Rubens. No, there's not. Okay, well, we'll look at Rubens at a later date. Okay, so let's look at two more examples of ceiling painting. Pietro de Cortina, who was equally gifted as an architect as he was a painter, carries ceiling paintings to a new level of bravura. Let's look at this example that we've actually seen here in our last presentation. This is called the Triumph of the Barberini at the Palazzo Barberini, which is in Rome, and this is from 1639. Okay, it shows this like fountain, practically, of figures pouring in from the side frescoes up into the central panel. Up and out, kind of into the clouds above. This is all illusionistic. There's no sculptural elements here at all. This is all a painting. But you look up at the ceiling. I've never seen this. It must be mind-blowing to look at. And what you see are all these people flying up into what appears to be an opening in the ceiling of this particular room. And out of this ceiling, you can see the sky above with the clouds and the sunlight and stuff like that. And people are just floating up and away out of this ceiling. We should all have these, like in our living room, I think. Okay, so let's talk about this scene. So this basically is an allegory of around the divine support of the papacy of Rome, of Pope Urban VIII. The scene culminates with the allegorical figure of divinity with raised hands. You can kind of see it, I think, slightly there in the central area, slightly to the right, who signals to immortality. And I think immortality is the orange robed figure. To place a crown of 12 stars above the Barberini coat of arms. Okay, so the Barberini family basically have placed themselves in this almost magical kind of holy religious experience. This, okay, so it's difficult really to get a full effect without actually being in the space of witnessing the sensation of these figures rushing upward towards the opening. Especially these figures that are crossing over this illusionistic architectural frame of the opening. And again, that's not a real architectural element. It's not the actual architecture of the ceiling. It's just painted. Okay? And it's set up that makes it seem like that they're kind of literally floating across and up out of the ceiling. And this is only also because of the way the shadows of the figures are cast down onto this painted architectural frame and everything. Really brilliant. This is about this bravura, this technical brilliance of the Baroque. This is way beyond what anybody would consider doing during the Renaissance. The closest we got was looking at the examples by Mantegna. If you remember his Dead Christ, looking in this foreshortening, looking up from his feet. And then we saw another one which was a ceiling painting, looking up out of a circular kind of opening. But this takes us to like a kind of technical kind of level of fancifulness, of showmanship that we never saw in the Renaissance whatsoever. Let's look at one more example. Another master of ceiling effects was Giovanni Battista Galli. Okay, this is his work called The Sacred Name of Jesus. And here we actually have a combination of real architectural elements and painted illusion. We have allegorical figures which are modeled here in white stucco that flank the windows and 4 white stuccoed angels which hold up the central frame. Jesuit saints float into and through the frame with angels in the clouds, painted on fields of plaster on the vault outside the frame. Again, you look up at this and you think, oh my gosh, there's people up here hanging out on the ceiling, floating out of this opening. There's a hole in the ceiling of this room, and I can see outside, and all this crazy stuff is happening up here. Must be lots of fun to look at. To complete the illusion of all these figures and clouds outside the frame that are shadows that are being cast on the gilded ceiling itself, and you can kind of see this shadows being cast by these figures, but they're not real. It's just paintings and they actually paint a shadow on part of the ceiling to make it look like there's something there in front of it casting a shadow. Okay? All right. Okay, good. So here we have another example of the Baroque ceiling painting. I want to end with that just as a way to kind of get started, to give you a sense of how things have changed from the Baroque. These are 2 good examples. Somebody such as Caravaggio, somebody such as this would never really have been produced such work in the Renaissance period. We have somebody like Michelangelo, who was known for his more kind of brooding kind of sensibility, but both in terms of his personal life and also in terms of the kind of work that he did. Caravaggio's much more extreme in terms of really looking into the kind of darker aspects of the human soul. And for the other example here of the Italian ceiling painters, the Carracci, and then these 2 examples that we've looked at, this kind of bravura, this kind of fancifulness, all this embellishment, this very much just typifies what we sort of typically think of when we think of Baroque art, particularly when we think of Baroque art in Italy. Okay, we'll move on from here, where we'll look at some more artists from the Baroque, and then start to move into the Baroque art of the North to see what was going on there as well. Okay, good. Thank you.